In the early 20th century, Great Britain was at the height of her imperial power, governing a quarter of the surface of the earth. We were also a nation of explorers, but problematically for British pride, we had failed to bag some of the major records. The Americans had beaten us to the North Pole in 1909, the Norwegians to the South Pole in 1911. However, we were determined that a Briton would reach the top of the world, Mount Everest. But frustratingly, several British expeditions had thus far failed to conquer the world's tallest mountain, and several foreign nations were also mounting competing attempts, fueling the race. We had come closest in 1924 when George Mallory and Andrew Irvine were last seen climbing towards the base of the summit pyramid. They had disappeared, fueling speculation that they had summited. Mallory's mummified corpse was discovered high on Everest in 1999, and the mystery remains unsolved to the present day. We may not have been able to climb Everest yet, but another explorer of a different kind was determined that the first flight over the top of the world would go to the British. Douglas Hamilton, Marquess of Clydesdale, was a Scottish aristocrat and son and heir to the Duke of Hamilton. Commissioned into the RAF in 1927, by 1933 he was the youngest squadron leader in the Air Force and an ambitious aerial explorer. The idea of flying over Mount Everest was not Clydesdale's. In 1918, famous mountaineer Alexander Kellis had proposed it, but Clydesdale was the first to attempt it. The expedition needed financial backing and specially designed aircraft. Clydesdale turned to rich widow Lucy Lady Houston, a philanthropist, political activist, and former suffragette. She had given generously to aviation in 1931, donating £100,000 to Supermarine, which captured the Schneider Trophy, and laying the foundations for the famous Spitfire aircraft of World War II. Houston agreed to put up the finance for the Everest attempt.
But isn't it most terribly dangerous?
No more than walking across Hampstead Heath on a foggy night. But seriously, of course it's the highest mountain in the world. It's true there must be some risk, but isn't it a risk well worthwhile?
Of course. It requires a lot of careful consideration. It's an immense adventure. That's what appeals to me. I agree. I'll help.
A committee was formed in London and a team assembled. Leading the expedition was Air Commodore Fellows.
Clydesdale will be first pilot. Blacker, chief observer.
The monocle-wearing Stuart Blacker was a noted inventor. A World War I flyer, he had become an interwar weapons developer using his own funds. He developed two notable World War II weapons, the Blacker Bombard, a kind of spigot mortar, which was later developed into the anti-U-boat weapon, the Hedgehog, and the Piat, projector infantry anti-tank, receiving £25,000 for his efforts with the latter weapon.
McIntyre will be second pilot to Lord Clydesdale. Bonnet will look after the film photography. You fellows are the obvious man to take charge.
There's no doubt about it. If we get going, fellows should have charge.
You say if. If we're going to make a start this year, there's not much time left. After April, the monsoon in the Himalayas would make the flight impossible.
Quite correct.
With the window of opportunity narrowing by the day, the Houston Everest Expedition proceeded to gather equipment. Two types of aircraft were designed and built to cope with the extremes of flying over Everest, the Westland PV-6 and a Westland PV-3. Both biplanes were carefully modified. The observers' positions were enclosed with several windows, but the pilots' cockpits remained open. Each aircraft was also fitted with an oxygen system, with tanks providing 15 minutes of oxygen when the aircraft reached their maximum altitude at over 30,000 feet over Everest. The crews also had an inbuilt heating system to keep them alive, but any failure in oxygen or heating at over 30,000 feet would be fatal in minutes. Both aircraft received highly supercharged Bristol Pegasus engines, able to cope at high altitude in the thin air. Apart from the prestige nature of the flight, there was also a practical aspect to it. Using both movie cameras and a Williamson automatic Eagle 3 camera, Clydesdale hoped to obtain the first photographs of the summit of Everest from above. Such photos would prove extremely useful in the planning of future British expeditions to be the first to summit Everest, and would be kept secret until 1951, providing a detailed mosaic picture of possible routes to the top. The Houston Everest Expedition established its forward base at an RAF airfield at Purnia in Bihar, India in March 1933. No one was under any illusions. The forthcoming mission would be very dangerous. If successful, it would set records for aviation, technology, and photography. But if anything went wrong with the planes, there was little chance that the crews would survive.
Now, I first want to clear up this forced landing business. Well, the first 50 miles of the flight is over excellent forced landing country, but of course it will be possible to pull off a satisfactory crash landing much nearer the mountain. Blacker, you know this country. We'd like to hear your views.
Well, as Clydesdale has said, from here till we cross the Mahabharat Range, it's remarkably good. Then from here onwards to this great peak Chumlung, we might be able to find small level patches. From Chumlung onwards to Mount Everest itself, any idea of a landing is just out of the question.
A series of violent storms in the high Himalayas prevented the mission from departing. But finally, on the 3rd of April 1933, the weather cleared. A reconnaissance plane piloted by Fellows was sent to the mountains to scout from a distance and report on the weather.
Well, what's the wind velocity? It's dropped considerably. No problem. 57 miles at 33,000. Well, I think that's about the best we're likely to get.
How's the visibility?
17,000 as a haze and no clouds. You prepared to go, Clydesdale?
I am indeed.
And you, McIntyre?
Rather, let's get on with it.
Well, come on, let's get our stress vessels down.
Right, I'll go and get the engine machines out.
The two crews donned their bulky sheepskin and leather flying suits and prepared for takeoff. At the same time, the expedition's aircraft were prepped by RAF and Indian ground crews.
Keep it going.
Steady there.
Mind that wing on the left.
Keep on moving.
Final safety checks were also made.
Warming up to it, isn't it?
Now, about this business of the heating and the oxygen,
Yes.
if anything goes wrong, it's absolutely your discretion, and there's no good being heroic. The only thing is for you to tell the pilot definitely to go back. Anything goes wrong with either of them.
Is that one full?
Quite okay, George. Put them in.
Righto, just coming.
Well, where's opening?
Here we are.
And then they were away, keeping tight formation, headed towards the Ford Emergency Landing Ground at Forbesgunge, 40 miles from Pernia, for their first view of Mount Everest. They climbed steadily into the foothills of the Himalayas, soon to pass beyond any safe landing ground. From now on, the only way was up.
Now. What? Up. Over cloud.
Soon the great Himalayan peaks started to become visible. The crews could see the top of the world, the first people in history to see it. Then Mount Everest emerged. The aircraft were at 33,000 feet, just 3,000 feet higher than the summit, the world's tallest mountain. They'd done it, captured the first pictures of the roof of the world. After several passes over the summit of Everest, the planes turned for Purnia in India.
Yes, Mac. Swing round. Swing round, Mac.
There? What did you like? All right.
The photos taken by the expedition would help the 1953 Everest Expedition to succeed some 20 years later, when New Zealander Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay became the first people to stand on the summit of Mount Everest.